When I first took the job as a park ranger up in the northern reaches of Montana, I thought I knew what I was getting into. I'd grown up around nature, always loved the outdoors, and figured this would be the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. I wasn't afraid of long stretches of solitude, and I certainly didn't mind the cold winters. I wanted quiet. I wanted peace. But the isolation had a way of playing tricks on the mind. And after what happened that winter, I no longer trust the silence of the wilderness. It started off like any other shift. I was assigned to patrol a section of the forest that was notorious for its rough terrain and bitterly cold nights. There had been reports of strange sounds and missing hikers, but honestly, I chalked it up to overactive imaginations or people underestimating the forest. That's how it always is, isn't it? Someone hears a rustle in the trees, and suddenly it's a bear or something far worse. That night, the temperature had dropped quickly. The kind of cold that bites right through your jacket and gnaws at your bones. I remember tightening my scarf and pulling my beanie further down over my ears as I made my way through the dark forest path, my flashlight cutting a weak beam through the fog that had rolled in earlier that afternoon. The radio on my hip crackled faintly, but there hadn't been any calls in hours. The park was eerily quiet, too quiet. Even the usual sound of animals scurrying in the underbrush was absent. No owls hooting, no distant howls of wolves. Just the crunch of my boots on the snow-packed trail. I paused for a moment, staring ahead into the dense forest. My breath came out in short clouds, hanging in the air before dissolving into the thickening fog. Something didn't feel right. The stillness of the woods felt unnatural. I stood there, straining to hear anything, but it was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then, it came. A sound. Far off, but distinct. A low, guttural growl that echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. I couldn't place the sound. It wasn't a wolf. It was something deeper. Something bigger. I raised my radio to my mouth, trying to keep my voice steady. This is Ranger Daniels, checking in. Anyone picking up strange noises near Sector 7? Static. I waited a few seconds, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried again. Sector 7. Anyone copy? More static. The radio was dead. I cursed under my breath, scanning the woods around me. The fog was getting thicker, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. I had no choice but to keep moving. My training told me to stay calm, to rationalize, but deep down, I felt it. Fear. A primal kind of fear I hadn't felt since I was a kid. I continued along the trail, every muscle in my body tensed, my flashlight casting jittery shadows in the fog. The growl came again, this time closer. My hand instinctively went to the knife on my belt, though I wasn't sure how much good it would do against whatever was making that sound. The trees around me seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, tall, gaunt, and impossibly thin, moving through the fog ahead of me. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, watching as the figure stepped out of the trees and into my line of sight. It was a man. Or at least, it had once been a man. Its body was emaciated, the skin stretched tight over sharp, protruding bones. Its face was hollow, with deep, sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. But the worst part, the part that made my blood run cold, was the way it moved. It didn't walk like a man. It slithered, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like it wasn't fully in control of its own body. I stood there, paralyzed, as the thing turned its head slowly toward me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of dread so intense that my legs nearly gave out beneath me. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. The Wendigo. I had heard the legends. Stories passed down from the indigenous people of the area. They spoke of a creature cursed by hunger, a spirit twisted by cannibalism and eternal starvation. I had never believed those stories before. I'd always thought they were just cautionary tales told to scare people from wandering too deep into the woods. But now, staring into the hollow eyes of this thing, I realized how wrong I was. It let out a low, guttural growl that reverberated in my chest, and then, without warning, it lunged. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as the Wendigo came at me with inhuman speed. Its long, bony fingers reached for me, and I could feel the icy cold radiating from its body. I managed to dodge to the side at the last second, my boots slipping on the icy ground. I hit the snow hard, gasping for air as the creature skidded to a halt, its head snapping back toward me with unnatural precision. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and bolted into the trees. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear it, heavy footfalls crunching through the snow, gaining on me. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I did, it would be the last thing I ever saw. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I kept running. I could feel the creature's presence closing in, the cold intensifying with every step. It was like the air around it was being sucked dry, leaving nothing but freezing, suffocating emptiness. I burst into a small clearing, the moonlight cutting through the fog just enough to illuminate a dilapidated ranger's cabin that had long been abandoned. Without thinking, I dove for the door, slamming it shut behind me. My hands shook as I threw the rusty bolt across the door, my breath coming in shallow, frantic bursts. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears and the distant howl of the wind outside. And then, a soft scratching at the door. My blood ran cold. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the door as the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was deliberate. The Wendigo was toying with me, waiting for me to make a mistake. A low growl echoed from the other side of the door, and I could hear the faint sound of wood creaking under pressure, as if something was leaning against it. The bolt groaned, straining against the weight. I had to think. I had to do something. But what? There was no way I could outrun it, and fighting it was suicide. My eyes darted around the cabin, searching for anything that could help. But the place was practically bare. Just a few broken chairs, an old stove, and a stack of firewood in the corner. The firewood. I rushed over and grabbed one of the logs, gripping it tightly in my shaking hands. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Suddenly, the door buckled under the weight, the wood splintering as the Wendigo slammed into it with terrifying force. I could see its twisted, skeletal fingers reaching through the cracks, clawing at the air. The growling grew louder, more frenzied. I backed into the far corner of the cabin, holding the log in front of me like a pitiful shield. My heart was racing, every muscle in my body tense and ready for the inevitable. And then, the door shattered. The Wendigo burst into the cabin, its hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. It moved with a sickening fluidity, its limbs jerking and twisting unnaturally as it crawled through the splintered remains of the door, The cold hit me like a physical force, and I could feel the air being sucked out of the room. I swung the log at it, but it barely seemed to notice. Its bony hand shot out, grabbing me by the arm with a grip like iron. I could feel the freezing cold spreading through my body, numbing my skin, turning my blood to ice. This was it. I was going to die here, in this godforsaken cabin, in the middle of nowhere. But then, something happened. The Wendigo froze, its head snapping up as if it had heard something. It let out a low, guttural growl, its grip on my arm loosening just enough for me to pull free. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, as the creature slowly turned and crawled out of the cabin, disappearing into the fog as suddenly as it had appeared. I stood there, shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My arm throbbed with cold, but I was alive. Barely. I don't know what made the Wendigo leave. Maybe it had found something more interesting to hunt. Maybe it was toying with me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't stay here. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with me yet. I grabbed my radio, hoping against hope that the signal had returned. "This is Ranger Daniels. I'm at the old cabin near Sector 7. I stood there in the broken doorway of the cabin, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I clutched the radio in my hand. The only sound was the distant howl of the wind, but my pulse was hammering in my ears, louder than any storm. The Wendigo had left, but I knew it wasn't gone. Not really. It was out there, watching, waiting. I squeezed the button on the radio again, my voice shaky. "This is Ranger Daniels. I'm at the old cabin near Sector 7. I'm in serious trouble. If anyone can hear me, please respond." Silence. I cursed under my breath, slamming the radio down on the table. There was no signal, no backup coming. I was completely on my own. The cold bit through my jacket, and my fingers felt numb from the adrenaline rush and the creeping frost. I grabbed the remaining firewood from the corner and shoved it into the stove, praying that I could at least keep the fire going for a little while longer. I needed the light, needed something to push back against the darkness creeping in around me. As I lit the fire and watched the flames slowly catch, the flickering light illuminated the cabin in a pale orange glow. Shadows danced on the walls, but they didn't feel like the comforting kind. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind felt like something alive, something closing in. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me that I was still being watched. The Wendigo might not be inside the cabin anymore, but I could feel it, its presence like an icy hand on the back of my neck. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do next. I couldn't stay here forever. That thing, whatever it was, would come back. And I wasn't sure if I'd survive another encounter. But if I went outside into the fog and the dark, I'd be even more vulnerable. The Wendigo knew these woods better than I did. It would be a hunt, and I was the prey. I thought of the legends again, trying to remember anything that might help. The stories said the Wendigo was a spirit of endless hunger, a creature born of cannibalism, its body twisted by its insatiable need to consume. Some said fire could keep it at bay, but I had a hard time believing that a creature like that would be afraid of a few flames. Others said it was drawn to the smell of fear, to desperation. Desperation. That's exactly what I felt. The fire crackled softly behind me, but the warmth did little to calm my nerves. I glanced around the cabin, looking for anything else I could use to protect myself. There wasn't much. A rusted axe leaning against the wall, some old rope, and a few dusty cans of food that had long since expired. I grabbed the axe, testing its weight. It was heavy, but I didn't care. It felt better to have something, anything, in my hands. Suddenly, there was a sound outside. A soft thud, like something heavy hitting the snow. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. Another thud. Closer this time. I held my breath, gripping the axe tighter, my eyes darting to the broken door. The firelight flickered wildly as the wind outside grew stronger, rattling the shutters. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just the storm. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me again. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. Faint, but unmistakable. My stomach twisted in fear as I backed away from the door. The growl grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging through the snow. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a drum in my ears. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see it again. But I had no choice. Slowly, I edged closer to the doorway, the axe raised in front of me, ready to swing. The dragging sound stopped. The air was still. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, just beyond the tree line. Tall, gaunt, its skeletal frame barely visible through the thick fog. It was standing perfectly still, its hollow eyes fixed on me, glowing faintly in the darkness. My blood turned to ice. The Wendigo was back. I stumbled back into the cabin, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the axe. The creature didn't move, didn't rush me like before. It just stood there, watching, as if waiting for me to make a mistake. The fire crackled behind me, casting long, jittery shadows across the room. I tried to calm myself, tried to think rationally. There had to be something I could do. I couldn't just wait for it to attack. The rope. I looked down at the old rope on the floor. An idea began to form in my mind, crazy, but it was the only thing I could think of. If I could lure the Wendigo into the cabin, maybe, just maybe, I could trap it. The fireplace was large enough to create a barrier between us, and the axe might buy me enough time to make my move. But I needed bait. I needed something to draw it in. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small pocket knife, wincing as I sliced a shallow cut across my palm. Blood welled up immediately, dripping onto the floorboards. The Wendigo didn't move, but I saw its head tilt slightly, as if it had caught the scent. I backed toward the far side of the room, away from the door, leaving a faint trail of blood on the floor. The creature let out another low growl, its body tensing as it crouched down, preparing to move. "Come on," I whispered to myself, my heart hammering in my chest. Just a little closer. The Wendigo moved, slowly at first, its long, bony limbs jerking with unnatural precision. It crossed the threshold of the broken door, its glowing eyes locked onto mine, drawn by the scent of blood. My breath caught in my throat as it entered the cabin, its presence suffocating, the temperature dropping even further. I held the axe tightly, backing up until I was against the far wall, the rope in my other hand. The creature moved closer, its growl vibrating through the walls of the cabin. I could see its skin stretched tight over its bones, its face twisted into a grotesque mask of hunger. Closer. Just a little closer. When it was within arm's reach, I swung the axe with everything I had. The blade connected with its arm, and a sickening crack echoed through the cabin. The Wendigo let out a piercing screech, rearing back in pain, its eyes blazing with fury. It stumbled, crashing into the table, but it wasn't down. Not yet. I threw the rope around its legs, pulling with all my strength as the creature thrashed and howled. It was strong, far stronger than I had anticipated, but the fire was at my back, and I knew it feared the flames. I dragged it toward the stove, using every ounce of strength I had left, the smell of burning wood filling the cabin. The Wendigo screamed again, its voice shrill and inhuman, as I shoved it toward the open stove. The flames licked at its skin, and it recoiled, but I didn't let go. I forced it closer, using the axe to keep it at bay as the fire began to consume it. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting wail, its body writhing in agony as the fire engulfed it. I stumbled back, gasping for breath as the flames grew higher, the cabin filled with thick, acrid smoke. For a moment, all I could hear was the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. The Wendigo was gone, its twisted form consumed by the flames. I collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking with exhaustion and terror. The fire burned brightly in the stove, casting long shadows across the room, but the cabin felt warmer now, safer. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The stories always said the Wendigo couldn't be killed, not really. It was a spirit, a force of nature. It could be driven away, but not destroyed. As I sat there in the flickering firelight, the smoke curling around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there. Waiting, watching, and that it would be back. I grabbed the radio again, my voice hoarse as I spoke into the static. "This is Ranger Daniels. Anyone out there?" A faint crackle. Then, a voice. "Copy that, Ranger. We're sending help." I exhaled, relief washing over me.